Hello and welcome to another episode of Unpopular Opinions. I'm Carlo and this is our channel, All You Can Board. This series was initially started by Dylan. You can go check out his first episode where he talks about why he didn't really like Tainted Grail. In today's video, I'm going to be telling you why Arboretum is best with 4 players. Now, the reason why this falls into this Unpopular Opinion series is because if you look at the BoardGameGeek rankings and you check out what people recommend as the best player count, it is unanimously recommended as a 2-player game. And if you go on Reddit and you look at BoardGameGeek forums, people seem to love this game at 2 players. And other than Dylan, I don't really know anyone else or haven't come across a whole lot of people who seem to like this game at most with 4. But I think it by far shines best at 4 players. It's not even comparable to the 2-player rank. So just for context here, before I get into it, the BoardGameGeek rankings, the way this works is if you vote on player count, you can vote for multiple categories. So these percentages are not going to add up. But as of today, filming this December 8th, Best with 2 has 52% of the votes, Best with 3 players has 40% of the votes, and Best with 4 players has only 33% of the votes. So out of 265 total voters, only 65 of those voters said it was best with 4. That means out of those 265, 200 people do not think it's best with 4 players. So I'm definitely in the minority here. I'm going to start by breaking down. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the game in case you haven't played it. Then I'm going to tell you what's different about it with 2 and 4 players. Then I'm going to tell you what are the best aspects of the game that help it shine best at the 4-player count. And then I will talk about a couple of minor drawbacks or things that some people could consider drawbacks at the 4-player count. So first off, what are you doing in Arboretum? Well, everyone has a hand of 7 cards at the start of the game. And the idea of the game is you're basically, on your turn, you have this common deck of cards you're drawing from. You're going to start by drawing 2 cards, either from the deck or players' discard piles, which are always face up to all players. You're going to draw 2 cards to go up to 9. Then you're going to play 1 card in your tableau, and then you're going to discard a card to go back down to 7. Players are going to take turns going in a clockwise fashion that way, drawing 2 cards, playing 1, discarding 1, until the central deck is depleted, at which point you'll go to final endgame scoring. So what's in the deck of cards? Well, it's pretty basic, honestly. This game could have been designed years and years ago with a different theme or whatever. There's nothing inherently special about it. There's just a certain number of tree types. I think there are 10 of them. And then there's 8 cards per type, each ranging with a number from 1 through 8. And you're basically going to be building out your tableau. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of the rules, but you're going to be building out your tableau in a way where your numbers and your tree types or colors are sort of connecting in a way that allows you to follow paths, with the first and the last card in that path being the most important to be of the same type. At the end of the game, the way the scoring is going to work is that you're going to go through each type of tree. For example, the maples, the blue spruces, the willows, one at a time, and you're going to, for each category, every player is going to reveal which cards of that type they still have in their hands. So let's say we said blue spruce. If this was my end of the game, I would show that I have the 1 and the 2. You're all going to compare, and only the player with the total highest value, like the added value of the cards, so in this case I would have 3, has the right to score for that type of tree. I might not even have any blue spruce cards, but by holding on to these, if all the other blue spruce cards were played in front of my opponents, I'm denying them, so they would all score 0 for blue spruce, as would I. So there's an element of holding on to cards until the end of the game to basically deny your opponent's points or to have the right to score points for your own tree types if you were going for that type. But the more you hold on to, the fewer points there are available to actually be scored in your tableaus. There's a couple other things, like if someone is holding an 8 in their hand and someone else is holding a 1, the 1 makes that 8 a 0. There's a couple other things, but that's the basic idea of how you play Arboretum. So now I'm going to talk about what's different with it as a 2-player game compared to 4 players. So depending on player count, if you play with 2 players, you're actually going to play with only a 48 card deck instead of an 80 card deck. With 3 players, I believe it is a 60 card deck. So you're basically removing 2 types of trees per player count, or sorry, 64 with 3 players. So you're going to be removing 2 types of trees for each player count that you reduce. So with 2 players, not only is it a smaller deck, but because you only have 1 opponent, it ends up being kind of this head-to-head duel type game, and it just plays out a little bit differently. So the game is also shorter because the smaller deck, there's usually going to be fewer turns. The game is usually going to be playing out a bit quicker. There's sort of less downtime, that kind of thing. So, but it ends up becoming much more of like a mathematical exercise. It becomes a game of card counting and calculations because you know what you need to have in your hand in order to score, and more of the game is open information. So I'm going to get to this now when I get into my phase here where I talk about why is it better as a 4-player game. And the 3-player count, just for reference, I would definitely say is closer to the 4-player game in terms of my enjoyment. It's still amazing at 3. I think there's just a huge gap between 2 and 3, and it definitely shines best at 4. So what makes it amazing at 4? So first off, the most important thing here is the end game scoring. So because this, as I said, is a game of hand management, and despite the beautiful inviting artwork and the really nice trees here, it's a really brutal, cutthroat game. Sometimes you can score 0 points in this game. I've done it more than once. I've seen other people get 0 points because you might be building out a tableau going for 3 or 4 different tree types, and everyone else is holding more of that type in their hand, and you just don't even get the right to score. So I love that. And the reason why that works better at 4 players, in my opinion, that's the biggest part, is because when it comes down to the final scoring, so because I have 3 opponents in a 4-player game and each of them has 7 cards in their hand, that's a total of 21 cards that are in players' hands that I don't know how they're going to affect the tree types that I have in play. Not only that, there are 10 tree types. So not only are there 10 types of trees, but there's 21 cards out there. How do I know who's going to be holding what, right? So let's say I have the 6 of a certain color in my hand. And let's say I know that I haven't seen, let's say the 4, the 3, and the 7 haven't come up. Now, if I was playing a 2-player game and that happened, I would know long before it even gets near the end of the game. If all I have is the 6 and I haven't seen a bunch of the other ones, I know that single one opponent of mine is holding those cards. I know I'm not going to score. In a 4-player game, let's say one of those players had a 3, another player had the 4, and let's say the 7 was in the discard pile and I kind of forgot about it. My 6 is going to be good enough to win, but one player could actually have the 3 and the 4, which would make a 7 total, which would beat my 6. And another player could actually be holding that 7, which would also beat my 6. So there's a lot more that's kind of up in the air. The game, has this arc with 2 players where the longer the game goes on, the tension kind of deflates out of the game a little bit because you're card counting along the way. You know what has been out there. You can see the discard piles face up as the game goes, and because the game ends when the deck is depleted, the only mystery left is the 7 cards in your opponent's hand, but you have a pretty good idea of what they're holding. So before the game ends, you kind of have a pretty good idea of how it's going to end, what you are or aren't going to, have the right to score on, and that sort of thing. So it kind of takes all the tension out of it, and it kind of feels like the game fizzles a bit near the end. Whereas in a 4-player game, the big end game reveal of who has what cards left, who's going to score for what, who's going to deny other players, it's like punctuated by the fact that all these cards are spread out across different players. You don't know who has what, who's going to win majority, who's going to be able to score for what. And I think that is just one of the best things that works well about this game at the 4-player count. So also, because I mentioned there's more tree types, you also are spread a bit more thin. So instead of like in a 2-player game where there's only 6 types of trees, it's easier to commit and pick which ones you want to go for. You also, as the hand management aspect comes into play, you don't have as many different tree types in your hand, so it's easier to kind of prioritize. The decisions become easier. What I love about this game, the beauty of this game, is in the agonizing decisions. It's the fact that you're always acquiring new cards and having to weigh, are you going to play this card for yourself to try and score? Are you going to hold on to these to try and score for that type? Are you going to try and deny your opponent? And having more types of trees gives you a wider variety of trees in your hand and on the board to play with, which just makes everything tougher because you don't know what to commit to. And similarly, the discard piles with 4 players makes it a lot more interesting as well. So let's say, the worst thing to do on your turn, or the thing that's like sort of least enjoyable, that's so agonizing, is discarding a card that you know someone else needs. And in a 2-player game, you know that if you discard that, your opponent's going to pick it up, right? In a 4-player game, let's say this player on my right is going for a certain type of trees, in this case, the tulip poplars. I can afford to discard a tulip poplar, and these 2 opponents here might say, what are you doing? They're just going to pick it up on their turn. But that's not my problem anymore. Now on this player's turn, the pressure's kind of on them. Do they want to let that sit in my discard pile until it gets around to that player? So now I'm kind of forcing this player here to maybe take it. And they might think, oh, well, it's not my problem either. When it goes over to this player, they're going to have to take it. So there's this kind of common added pressure that goes around the table of as soon as someone discards a card, everyone's kind of thinking, who's going to pick that up to deny that player, or are we all just going to let it go around to them so they can just pick up that card they need? And again, that's just completely robbed of the game in a 2-player game, because anything you discard that your opponent wants, they're clearly just going to pick up. Why wouldn't they? And with 4 players, right from the very first turn of the game, the tension just is ratcheted up from the very first card played. Let's say on the very first turn of the game, I play this yellow 3 Cassia card. As soon as I have played it, basically any other player who's holding a yellow card in their hand is not going to discard. They're probably going to stubbornly hang on to that card for the rest of the game. So immediately you place that card and you're looking over, second guessing, wondering who is trying to screw you over here, who is trying to hold out. And so it makes it like immediately you don't even know what to play off the start because players could be holding anything. So from the very start of the game, the hand management, the tableau building aspect, having these extra trees and more unknowns of what's going on out there. I just love that the 4-player game makes you act a little bit more on your intuition and sort of looking across the table, looking at people in the eyes and trying to think, what do they have? Are you holding this card I need? Are you holding this? Maybe, maybe not kind of thing. Whereas in a 2-player game, it just becomes more of a mathematical series of calculations. Okay, this came out, this didn't come out. And as the game goes on, it just feels like things get less and less interesting. It does work well as a 2-player game still. I'm not saying it's a bad 2-player game, but for how amazing it is at 4 players, I just don't see why anyone would prefer to play it with 2 or think it's better with 2. There's better 2-player games out there. I would highly recommend something like Lost Cities or Battle Line if you want something that has a little more of that mathematical edge, a bit more of the card counting. There's still some mystery and intrigue to those games, and I think those are better 2-player only games. I do think Arboretum is better than Lost Cities. Hard to say where I rank it against Battle Line, just in terms of a game, in terms of this as 4 players versus Battle Line as a 2-player game. But yeah, as a 2-player game, I would recommend those over Arboretum any day just because of how much of the tension is removed from this when you play it with 2 players. So that's not to say that the game is perfect with 4 or that everything about the game is better at 4. With 4 players, there's definitely more downtime between turns, right? Because after you take a turn, you have to watch 3 other people go. And so you're only taking 1/4 of the turns instead of half the turns in the game. Fair enough. The game also takes a bit longer. There's more cards in the deck. Turns are maybe more difficult because people have more to consider. So it does add to the game length. I find that with 4 players, it's usually in the 45-minute to an hour mark. Maybe with experienced players who aren't thinking too much about it, you can get half an hour kind of thing. And this last point isn't a fair drawback to say always applies, but there is a higher chance of there being that analysis paralysis. If you're playing with players who are really trying to maximize their score or calculate everything, it could really slow the game down. But this also ties into the beauty of what I said about the scoring is being hidden and the calculations aren't always possible, because once you've played the game enough, whether it's your first play, your second, 5th play, 10th play, whatever, eventually you start to realize playing with 3 or 4 players that it's just not possible to calculate everything, and you start realizing I have to play sort of on my intuition. I have to go off my gut feeling and just trust it and kind of go out on a whim and kind of hedge my bets on certain things. And again, that makes the game sing rather than falter the way it does with 2 players. I could go on and on about why I love this game so much, and especially why I love it at 4, but I've highlighted anything I can think of off the top of my head that makes this game best at 4 players. But I'm curious to hear, if you're one of those people who likes the game best at 2, tell me why. If you were going into this video that you liked it best at 2, if I've somehow changed your mind and you're willing to reconsider now, or you think, hey, you make some good points, also let me know. I'm curious to hear, if I convinced anyone to change their mind or whatnot. And if there's anything you think I've overlooked at why the game plays better at 2, also let me know. I'm really curious to hear. I often agree with the BoardGameGeek recommended player counts for most games, and that's why I decided to do this video on Arboretum. It's a game I absolutely love, one of my favorite card games, small box card games of all time. It's probably a $15, $20 game kind of thing. Excellent game. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend you check it out. And if you have, tell me what player count you like it best at and why. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, subscribe to our channel for more videos like this, keep an eye out for our top 50 games of all time, which Dylan and I will be doing in the coming weeks. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.